April 29th, 1945. 13:47 hours. The Hague, Netherlands. 8-year-old Hendrika van der Meer heard the bombers before she saw them. That deep, unmistakable rumble of bomber engines that had meant death and destruction for 5 years. She looked up from the tulip bulb she'd been trying to chew, her stomach hollow from 3 days without real food, and saw the formations approaching low over the city. Her mother pulled her close, both of them pressed against the wall of their damaged apartment building. The British Lancasters were flying at perhaps 400 feet, impossibly low, close enough to see individual aircraft, close enough to hear the engine roar that shook windows and made the ground vibrate. "They're coming to finish us," someone shouted from across the street. After Market Garden's failure and the brutal German reprisals that followed, the Dutch had learned to fear those bombers. But these weren't climbing to bombing altitude. They were maintaining that dangerously low approach, and their bomb bay doors were opening. Then the first parachutes deployed. Not bombs, canvas sacks tumbling from aircraft bellies, parachutes snapping open, packages drifting down toward the streets and parks of The Hague. One landed 30 meters from Hendrika, bursting open on impact. Loaves of bread rolled across the cobblestones, tins of meat scattered. A chocolate bar skidded to a stop near her feet. Her mother stared in incomprehension for 3 seconds before understanding broke through. She ran toward the scattered food, crying, laughing, unable to process what was happening. Around them, other Dutch civilians were emerging from shelters and damaged buildings, running toward falling packages, gathering food that couldn't be real but was. Hendrika picked up the chocolate bar with trembling hands. She hadn't seen chocolate since 1942. The wrapper was British, unmistakably British, with English text and royal crest. She looked up at the Lancaster still overhead, its crew visible through windows, and waved with desperate gratitude. Inside the bomber, Flight Lieutenant James Wilson saw the waving Dutch civilians and felt his throat tighten. 4 years of war had taught him to compartmentalize, to complete missions without thinking about targets below. But this mission was different. These weren't enemy positions or industrial targets. They were starving civilians who'd been allies until war had separated them, and his bomber's payload was food instead of explosives. The first time in hundreds of missions, he'd dropped something meant to save rather than destroy. The Hunger Winter. The Dutch Hunger Winter of 1944-45 was deliberate starvation imposed by German occupation forces in retaliation for Dutch resistance and Allied military operations. The crisis began after Operation Market Garden's failure in September 1944. Allied forces had attempted to capture bridges across the Rhine, liberate the Netherlands, and strike into Germany's industrial heartland. The operation failed catastrophically, leaving northern Netherlands under German control while southern provinces were liberated. German authorities responded to Dutch support for Allied forces by imposing systematic restrictions on food distribution. Rail transport was shut down. Canals were blocked. Food supplies from agricultural regions couldn't reach cities. The policy was explicitly punitive. Dutch resistance and cooperation with allies would be punished through mass starvation. The winter of 1944-45 was exceptionally harsh. Rivers froze. Roads became impassable. What little food remained in cities couldn't be supplemented by imports. Fuel ran out, forcing families to burn furniture and books for heating. Electricity was cut off for most areas. Water systems failed. The infrastructure that sustained urban life collapsed entirely. The Dutch population responded with desperate survival measures. They consumed tulip bulbs, the Netherlands' famous flower reduced to starvation food. They boiled leather to make soup. They burned anything flammable, furniture, books, wooden fences, even floorboards from their own homes. They traveled to countryside, attempting to trade valuables for food, though German restrictions made this increasingly impossible. By April 1945, the situation was catastrophic. Deaths from starvation exceeded 200 daily in Amsterdam alone. Hospitals couldn't treat patients because no medications existed. Doctors watched people die from diseases easily treatable under normal conditions, but fatal when combined with severe malnutrition. The morgues overflowed. Bodies were buried in mass graves because individual funerals were impossible. The impossible solution. The solution required negotiating with enemy forces who still controlled occupied territory and convincing them to allow humanitarian operations in active war zone. The British proposed Operation Manna, food drops to Dutch cities by RAF bombers that would fly at extremely low altitude to ensure accuracy and demonstrate peaceful intent. The risks were substantial. German anti-aircraft batteries remained operational. Fighter aircraft were still available. A single flak commander deciding to open fire could turn mercy mission into massacre of bomber crews flying too low and slow to evade. The operation required German agreement to hold fire during food drops. Negotiating this involved complex discussions through neutral intermediaries, Swedish Red Cross representatives, Swiss diplomats, underground resistance networks. The Germans were informed that RAF bombers would fly specified routes at specified times, dropping food only, and that any attack on these missions would be considered war crime, prosecuted after inevitable German surrender. German military authorities agreed, partly from recognition that war was lost, partly from understanding that allowing civilian starvation would worsen their treatment after surrender, partly from simple humanity that survived even among forces responsible for occupation. The agreement was fragile, depending on communication, reaching all German units, and individual commanders choosing not to fire despite having bombers flying at ranges where they couldn't miss. RAF Bomber Command issued mission briefings that emphasized both humanitarian importance and extreme risk. Crews would fly at 400 feet, altitude where German ground fire would be devastating. They would follow precise routes over still occupied territory. They would rely entirely on German agreement to hold fire, agreement that might not reach all units, that individual commanders might ignore, that could collapse if single nervous gunner opened fire. The briefing concluded with call for volunteers. Squadron commanders expected perhaps half would volunteer for mission this dangerous. Instead, nearly every crew volunteered. After 4 years of dropping bombs, the opportunity to drop food was irresistible. These were men who'd flown dozens or hundreds of combat missions, who'd seen friends die, who'd delivered destruction to German industrial targets and cities. The chance to save rather than destroy represented something profound. Opportunity to demonstrate that fighting had purpose beyond violence, that victory included mercy, that they were something more than instruments of destruction. The mission preparation. Preparing Operation Manna required transforming bomber squadrons from instruments of destruction into humanitarian relief force. The Lancasters and other bombers had their bomb racks modified to carry food packages instead of explosives. Each aircraft would carry between 3 and 5 tons of supplies: flour, bread, canned meat, dried milk, chocolate, cigarettes, medical supplies. The packages were secured to prevent damage during drop and marked with British and Dutch flags to identify them as humanitarian supplies. The packages themselves represented careful planning. Food had to be durable enough to survive drop from 400 feet, nutritious enough to address severe malnutrition and packaged in quantities that Dutch civilians could transport and distribute. Bread was baked specifically for the operation, harder than normal to prevent crushing. Flour was double-bagged to prevent bursting. Tins were selected for strength. Everything was designed to reach the ground intact and immediately useful. The routes were planned with precision unusual for bomber operations. Instead of high-altitude approaches that minimized exposure to ground fire, the aircraft would fly at 400 feet, following exact paths that kept them over designated drop zones, parks, fields, open areas where food could be recovered without endangering civilians with falling packages. The navigation required perfect timing and coordination. Dozens of bombers following precise routes at dangerously low altitude with no margin for error. The crews received briefings that emphasized both mission importance and personal risk. They would be flying slowly enough and low enough that single machine gun could bring down aircraft. They would be depending entirely on German forces holding fire as agreed. If fighting resumed for any reason, they would be defenseless targets. Flight Lieutenant Wilson, who'd flown 47 bombing missions over Germany, later described the briefing as most anxious he'd experienced. Bombing targets at 20,000 feet. You felt relatively safe. Height and speed were protection. But this mission, we'd be at 400 feet, flying straight and level over enemy positions. If they fired, we were dead. But the alternative was watching Dutch civilians starve, and that wasn't acceptable. So we volunteered. The first drop, April 29, 1945. The first wave of Operation Manna launched from RAF Mildenhall and other bases in eastern England. The formations crossed the North Sea at normal altitude, then descended as they approached Dutch coast. At 400 feet, the aircraft were low enough that Dutch civilians could see crew faces through windows. The bombing runs, if they could be called that, were executed with precision that reflected years of combat experience applied to humanitarian purpose. The bomb aimers, who'd calculated trajectories for high explosives, now calculated drop points for food packages. The pilots who'd fought through flak and fighters maintained steady courses over Dutch cities while watching for any sign German forces might open fire. The gunners who'd defended bombers against enemy aircraft now watched ground positions nervously, knowing they were helpless if shooting started. The first packages fell over The Hague at 13:45 hours. Parachutes deployed. Not the dramatic explosions crews were accustomed to seeing, but gentle deployment of canvas and nylon. Packages drifting down towards streets and parks where Dutch civilians had gathered after spotting the approaching bombers. The reaction was immediate and overwhelming. Dutch families who'd been starving for months saw food falling from sky like biblical manna. They ran toward drop zones, gathering packages, weeping with relief and disbelief. Some fell to their knees. Others waved Dutch flags they'd hidden throughout occupation. Children spelled "thank you" in giant letters, using sheets on the ground where bomber crews could see them. Inside the bombers, hardened combat veterans found themselves crying behind oxygen masks. They'd delivered destruction to Germany for years, watching cities burn, knowing they were killing civilians as well as destroying military targets. Now, they were delivering life to people who'd been allies, watching Dutch civilians celebrate rather than fleeing or dying. The emotional impact was profound and unexpected. Some crews spontaneously added their own rations to the drop. Chocolate bars, cigarettes, biscuits, personal supplies thrown from windows with messages written on wrappers. With love from England. Hold on, help is coming. God bless you. The messages were unnecessary, but represented something important: personal connection between crews and civilians below, acknowledgement that this was humanitarian mission that transcended military objectives. German forces watched without interfering. Anti-aircraft crews stood beside their guns but didn't fire. Some German soldiers helped Dutch civilians carry packages, silent acknowledgement that war was effectively over, that continuing to inflict suffering served no purpose. A few German officers later admitted the food drops represented their first understanding of what defeat would actually mean, that allies capable of this mercy might extend it to Germany itself. The expanding operation. Over the following 10 days, Operation Manna expanded to become one of the largest humanitarian airlifts ever conducted during active combat. The RAF flew over 3,000 sorties, dropping 6,000 tons of food supplies to Dutch cities. The United States Army Air Force joined with parallel Operation Chowhound, adding American bombers to the humanitarian effort. Between British and American operations, over 11,000 tons of food reached starving Dutch civilians, while German forces still held the territory. The drops occurred daily, weather permitting. Bomber streams that had once carried explosives now carried bread and flour. Aircraft that had struck German industrial targets now supplied Dutch cities. The operational tempo matched combat operations, multiple sorties daily, precise navigation, detailed planning, all applied to feeding rather than fighting. The Dutch population organized rapidly to collect and distribute supplies. Resistance networks coordinated distribution to prevent hoarding and ensure food reached those most desperately in need. Local authorities worked with British liaison officers who'd been dropped by parachute to coordinate supply needs and drop locations. The entire operation evolved into collaboration between Allied forces, Dutch resistance, and civilian population. The food diversity increased as operations continued. Initial drops focused on staples: flour, bread, canned meat. Later drops included dried milk for children, medical supplies for hospitals, chocolate and cigarettes for morale, even seeds for planting gardens that would provide food after occupation ended. The supplies represented comprehensive approach to addressing starvation crisis: immediate calories to prevent deaths, medical supplies to treat malnutrition-related diseases, and resources for longer-term food security. The psychological impact equaled the nutritional benefit. Dutch civilians who'd endured 5 years of occupation, who'd watched their country destroyed and seen thousands die from starvation, received tangible evidence that allies hadn't forgotten them. The food represented more than calories. It was proof that liberation was coming, that their suffering was ending, that they'd survived long enough to see freedom. The cost and risk operation. Manna's success masked substantial risks that could have turned humanitarian mission into tragedy. The aircraft flew over territory where German forces retained capability to inflict catastrophic casualties. Anti-aircraft batteries remained operational with ammunition supplies and trained crews. Fighter aircraft were still available, though increasingly grounded by fuel shortages. The agreement to hold fire was fragile, dependent on communication, reaching all units, on individual commanders choosing to comply, on no misunderstandings or accidents triggering combat. Several incidents nearly ended the operation. A German anti-aircraft crew at Rotterdam began tracking RAF bomber before their commander ordered them to stand down. An American bomber strayed from designated route and nearly triggered defensive fire before Dutch resistance members signaled German forces that it was part of humanitarian operation. A British aircraft had mechanical failure and crashed, though fortunately, in liberated territory rather than occupied zone where crew would have been captured. The weather posed constant challenges. Low-altitude flight in April weather meant navigating through rain, fog and wind that made precision drops difficult and increased risk of aircraft collisions. Several bombers returned with weather damage. One suffered lightning strike that knocked out electrical systems but managed to complete drop before withdrawing. The crews understood the risks and flew anyway. Squadron loss rates during Operation Manna were 0. No aircraft lost to enemy action, no crews killed. But that outcome wasn't guaranteed. Every sortie represented conscious decision by crews to risk their lives delivering food to people they'd never met, in country they'd been fighting over, depending on enemy forces showing restraint that couldn't be certain. Flight Lieutenant Wilson later reflected on the risk calculation. We'd risked our lives hundreds of times dropping bombs. Risking them dropping food seemed the least we could do. If we'd been shot down during Manna, at least we'd have died doing something worthwhile rather than just destroying more cities. That mattered to us. The Liberation Connection Operation. Manna's timing, final days of April 1945, meant it directly preceded German surrender and Dutch liberation. On May 5th, German forces in Netherlands surrendered unconditionally. Allied forces entered Dutch cities within hours, completing liberation that Market Garden had failed to achieve 8 months earlier. The food drops had kept population alive through the final critical weeks. Had Operation Manna not occurred, thousands more would have died in those final days before liberation. The Dutch population greeted Allied forces with celebrations that reflected months of accumulated gratitude. British and Canadian troops entering Amsterdam, Rotterdam, and The Hague were mobbed by crowds, waving flags, throwing flowers, embracing soldiers, singing anthems. The celebrations were joyous, but also carried desperate edge. These were people who'd survived starvation through combination of endurance and Allied intervention. Many Dutch civilians specifically sought out RAF crews to thank them for food drops. Families brought photographs showing parachutes falling, packages being collected, food being distributed. They described what the drops had meant, the difference between survival and death, between hope and despair, between holding on through final days and giving up. The final mission. Netherlands, May 1945. The final Manna missions. Flight Lieutenant Wilson flew his last humanitarian sortie on May 4th, hours before German surrender. His Lancaster carried flour and medical supplies to Rotterdam, dropping them with precision that reflected hundreds of combat missions, repurposed for preservation rather than destruction. He watched Dutch civilians gathering packages below, waving flags and spelling messages of gratitude with sheets. He'd seen many things during 4 years of war: cities burning, aircraft exploding, friends dying. He'd delivered thousands of tons of explosives to German targets, knowing his actions killed people even while serving legitimate military purpose. But this, flying at 400 feet over Dutch city, dropping food to starving civilians, seeing gratitude rather than destruction, this felt like what they'd been fighting for all along. Not just defeating Germany, but proving that civilization meant something, that Allied victory would include mercy, that power could be used to preserve rather than destroy. His bomb aimer reported packages deployed successfully. Wilson banked the Lancaster toward England, climbing to safer altitude, leaving behind Dutch civilians who would survive because British bombers had delivered bread instead of bombs. The war would officially end within days. Germany would surrender unconditionally. Allied forces would occupy German territory and begin difficult work of reconstruction and reconciliation. But Operation Manna had already demonstrated what victory would mean. Not just military defeat of enemy, but positive affirmation of values that made victory worthwhile. British pilots had risked their lives dropping food to people who'd been friends before war separated them. They'd flown dangerously low over enemy-controlled territory, depending on restraint from forces who could have killed them easily. They'd done this because watching civilians starve was intolerable, because they were fighting for principles that included mercy, because power meant nothing if not used to preserve life when possible. The grey dawn over Netherlands revealed cities where Dutch families were eating British bread, where children were drinking British milk, where hospitals were treating patients with British medical supplies. The bombers that had symbolized destruction had become instruments of preservation. The crews that had delivered death to Germany had delivered life to Netherlands. Wilson crossed the English coast as sun rose. His aircraft was empty, except for crew, all supplies dropped, mission complete. But the experience would remain with him for lifetime. Operation Manna had proven that even in total war's final days, humanity survived. That mercy was possible. That British forces fought not just against evil, but for something better. That victory included compassion. The starving Dutch families, who wept when British pilots risked their lives to drop food, remembered that compassion forever. The bread that fell from sky became legend, story passed through generations, proof that even war's darkest moments could include light. The British pilots who flew those missions remembered them as most meaningful of their service. The times they saved rather than destroyed, preserved rather than fought, demonstrated through actions what Allied victory actually meant. The grey morning when bombers crossed back to England, empty of food but carrying satisfaction of mission completed, marked something essential about British character and Allied values. Power used for preservation, risk accepted for humanitarian purpose, victory defined not just by defeating enemies, but by saving innocents. Those principles, demonstrated through bread falling from sky over starving Netherlands, proved what the war had been about more clearly than any battlefield triumph ever could.